Welcome to Folk and Trad, a program that concentrates on folk and traditional music here around Thurston County. My name is Burt Meyer, your host for Folk and Trad, and we've delved back into the archives for this program. Back in 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, I taught a class out at Tumwater High School called American History Through Folk Music, wherein the kids got a chance to learn about their history through the folk songs and also even to play some instruments. While I was there, I was able to get in some wonderful guest lecturers, and we're going to present one of those for you tonight, a fellow named Paul Roberts, who's going to bring us the steel guitar and the slide guitar and the Dobro. They're all of a slide family. So, here's Paul Roberts.
Hawaiian and slide guitars. And the guitar found its way into other kinds of music, most notably blues kind of music and old black blues and other types of blues music, and into country music. And it's probably most famous for its work in country music, as Hawaiian music tended to start to die out, I don't know, probably around the 30s somewhere, if it's not too far along. The fad of Hawaiian music just died and away, or slowly went away, or whatever, and left its instruments to those who wanted to pick them up in the blues and country vein. And now, I think both the Dobro and all of the slide instruments are finally breaking out of even the country vein, which I think is good, because I think it's somewhat unique that all of these instruments are only now being used in other types of music, which means they've sort of been hidden for an awful long time and sort of confined to country. No one has really tried to take them away. And now they're being used in jazz and rock and pop. Certainly the pedal steel is being used in all sorts of kinds of music, and the Dobro is as well being used in popular music and even now in jazz. I don't know if you're familiar with David Grisman. The David Grisman quartet or quintet, depending on whether they have a Dobro player or not. They play a lot of jazz, country jazz, with the same instruments that you would find in a bluegrass band, except they're playing very melodic and some very interesting jazz. So the instrument is finding its way into other types of music. I don't know how much you want to go into the actual ways these things are tuned. Have you all been studying any of the music, the actual music and the progressions?
Only the Hawaiian started not so much the progressions or the tunings. The tunings wouldn't be much right now. Except that we discussed that it is tuned in an open chord so that you could strike.
Right. You get a full chord, or you might call two chords on top of one another. So you get two very different voicings, or you might say you get the potential for 4 distinct voicings on any one chord you want to take. So you can just you have a lot of variations right with the bar, the use of the bar. Something I do want to show you before we leave is that what happens when you play this instrument, as opposed to, say, the other types of slide instruments, you use finger picks, and everyone has a compulsion to put these on backwards the first time they think, because they think you want to pick the string like that. But actually, the finger picks just slide across the strings, and the bar, this particular kind of instrument, or most of the Dobro instruments are played with this kind of bar, although Earl will show you an exception to that, but most Dobro players will use what's called a Stevens bar, and the cross-section of it looks sort of like this, and it's ribbed so that as you hold it, your fingers work this way, and what it does allow you to do is give you a lot of control to move around the instrument. Now, Earl plays a different style of Dobro, and he'll be in here tomorrow, and he uses a very large round bar, the same type used on a pedal steel, and he does not pick the bar up that much. He does most of his work on actually sliding the instrument, and sliding the bar up and down the instrument touches out. The more modern techniques that are used now for the jazz and both jazz and more rapid country stuff would be this bar. And I suppose we just might as well play some. Though it's not a dobro, it'll give you an idea of the style of playing that's used here.
Back about 1825, I left Tennessee very much alive. And would make you the Arkansas wood if I hadn't been riding on the Tennessee stud. I had some trouble with my sweetheart's paw. One of her brothers was a man outlaw. I sent him a letter from my uncle's, but then I rode away with the Tennessee stud. Now the Tennessee stud, he was long, lean, colored in the sun, and his eyes were green. He had the nerve and he had the blood, and the devil was a horse like the Tennessee stud. Well, we drifted on down into no man's land, across that river called the Rio Grande. I raced my horse with the Spaniards, home till the cotton skin pulled the silver and gold. Well, I got about as lonesome as a man could be, thinking of a gal back in Tennessee. And the Tennessee stud's green eyes turned blue, cause he was thinking of a sweetheart too. Tennessee stud was long, lean, the color of the sun, and his eyes were green. Now he had the nerve and he had the blood, and the devil was a horse like a Tennessee stud. Well, I got about as lonesome as a man could be. I was thinking of my gal back in Tennessee. Tennessee stud's green eyes turned blue, cause he was thinking of a sweetheart too. So we loped on back across Arkansas. Yeah, whooped her brother and whooped her paw. Found that gal with the golden hair, and she was riding on the Tennessee mare. Well, a Tennessee stud, he was long and lean, and colored in the sun, his eyes were green. Now he had the nerve and he had the blood, and there never was a horse like a Tennessee stud.
From the dobro and into country music, which that was I don't know how long ago that song was, but it was written, and I'm not sure it's important, except that it's fairly typical country type of song. And I guess about in the 1930s and later on, and much more popular in the 1940s, instruments became electrified, and leading on up to where we are today. And as Burt and I were talking about some of this last night, we really sort of dawned on us, I suppose, I'm sure we were aware of it beforehand, that the instruments haven't really changed all that much as far as the way they're electrified until the last 10 years, where electronics have really taken off and given it a lot of other possibilities. But the actual pickup and structure and so on really hasn't changed that much. And these instruments, which are simply electrified dobros, are really no more different now today, and incidentally they're still being built, although a limited number, than they were 30, almost 40 years ago. Excuse me, I'm getting some CB here, so if any of you know what channel this is, I'll turn it so we don't have to listen. But the slide guitar was one of the first, if not the first instrument to be amplified. And this one is an old one, and I do not know the date or how old this thing is. I suspect that it's out of the 40s just because of the artwork in it, probably late 40s. It also is, incidentally, the first and only time I've ever seen this kind of mechanical changer, which was later put into the pedal steels by pedal and knee levers. But this thing, this gear shift knob here, which is very awkward and basically useless, at this point anyway, actually pulled the strings, and it was the first attempt at mechanically changing the tone so that the player, the kind of things that I have to do with the bar and with my hand on that instrument would be done mechanically by some other activity so that the bar could remain stable. All it does now is turn them on. You hear some slight tone variation, and these screws would come down and pull on the strings, and I'm sure it was very awkward and probably given up by the company about 3 weeks after they started because they couldn't figure out how to make it work right. But this happens to have that on it, and I think for that reason it's an indication as to how early people were trying to make mechanical changes without moving the bar, or the steel players, the people that played the instruments, were obviously confronted with a problem. They couldn't move the bar or move certain strings underneath the bar and leave the bar in the same place at the same time, which is what the pedal steel ultimately answered. But here they were trying to do that with another mechanical device. And as I guess it's difficult for you to see me playing it, and there's no way with the volume pedal I can stand up, so I don't know how you might see it, but there are certain movements of the bar that a steel player would use, and all of this mechanical junk underneath is designed to make those movements for the player so that he or she does not have to move that bar. That you can leave it steady and then make all the changes underneath with your legs and feet. It becomes very awkward, and of course you have to have some sort of coordination, I suppose, underneath all of that, but you begin to associate the movements with the tones, and we'll get into that a little later. But maybe we ought to play some old country stuff, because later the steel guitar began to be used in the country vein primarily. Hawaiian music had died out. The blues music was still using the steel guitar, but they were using it in some different ways, primarily bottleneck type of steel guitar, and that's basically where the blues and this type of steel guitar parted, although there are today people who use these kind of instruments in blues. And I myself do play in a band, and we do blues, and I do use the guitar on this, and I'll demonstrate a little of that at the end. But
what a beautiful thought I am thinking concerning that great speckled earth. Remember, her name is recorded on the pages of God's holy word, with all the other birds flocking round. She is so despised by the small. The great speckled bird is the Bible, representing the great Church of God.
that's right, key change. This is a key change.
Desiring to lower her standard, they watch every move that she makes. They long to find fault with her teaching, but really they find no mistake. I am glad I have learned of her meekness. I am proud that my name is on her book, for I want to be one never fearing the face of my Savior's true love. great speckled bird. On the wings of that great speckled bird.
Yeah, Jimmy Rogers probably did as much to get this steel, this particular type of steel. I guess this was the state of the art in steel at the time he was playing, and he probably did as much to get it in the mainstream of music as anyone. And I know we have at least one Jimmy Rogers tune that we decided to try to do, provided I remember the key changes and so on. But,
We'll go into, it's called Waiting for a Train. Jimmy Rogers is a person that was very important in the movement of country music, so we'll probably spend about a week on him and his works. So you'll hear this again. He was called a singing brakeman, because he worked as a brakeman on a train, or he's called a Mississippi Blue Yodeler. And I'm going to attempt one of his style yodels, so we'll see somewhat what it was like. He was the first one to put this kind of yodeling, or this kind of thing. It's a simple style of yodeling. He's the first one to do it, so at least to record it. It may have been done lots before that, but not any recorded instances that we have.
All around the water town, waiting for a train. 1,000 miles away from home, just sleeping in the rain. I walked up to the brakeman, give him a line of talk. He says, if you got money, I'll see that you don't walk. Well, I haven't got a nickel, not a penny can I show. He said, get off your railroad bum, and then he slammed that boxcar door. I dearly love, with the wide open spaces all around me, the moon and the stars above. Well, nobody seems to want me. Well, lend me a helping hand. I'm on my way for Frisco. I'm going back to Oaksy Land. A yodeling, a lady, a lady. Is empty and my heart is filled with pain. I'm 1,000 miles away from home. I'm just waiting for a train. A yodeling, a lady, a lady.
And I suppose the next most famous introduction of the steel guitar into the mainstream of American music, anyway, was Leon McAuliffe, who played a very interesting contraption, not all that different from this, and then it had 3 necks instead of 2, and it had no pedals, and it was called a steel guitar. It was very much the same thing as this, only 3 of them on one giant block of wood. And he played with Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, and he wrote this song, which is called Steel Guitar Rag, and you probably all heard it before, although you may not have known that he was the culprit that laid it on you originally. And he's still alive and still playing, and every now and then, although Bob Wills is dead, every now and then the whole gang gets together, and a lot of people are learning how to swing dance, and what you see is passing is disco dancing these days with a lot of twirls and so on. That's straight jitterbug and western swing that's being applied to disco. So there is a lot of cross-fertilization of music going on here. Don't let anybody tell you that was dreamed up with shake, 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 or whatever that is. Sort of the way it's supposed to be. This is a song written by Mike Aldridge, who has really pioneered the dobro into some prominence. If you're familiar with Linda Ronstadt and Emmylou Harris and Jonathan Edwards, some more contemporary artists that if you hear the dobro on, it's Mike Aldridge doing all of the backup work. He now makes a living as a studio musician, doing nothing but dobro work. And he's written a lot of songs and really pushed the instrument into some positions of prominence in the last few years in the world of dobro. And this is a song that should be played on a dobro. There's no reason why it can't be played on this thing. It's called Pick Away. Okay. That's now the interesting thing about moving on an electric instrument as opposed to a dobro is in a dobro you can pick all the notes and just let them go. On an electric instrument that's not as easy because you get all these notes starting to mess up one another because these things are built for sustain. You can go forever.
Keeps right on going.
Darn near. Musically, that's forever. How many? So you've got the ability to grab a note or a chord and leave it there. And that's very much why you hear steel, particularly now the electrified steel and pedal steel used in music today, is because it serves, it plays some of the very same roles in country or rock music that an organ would supply. It provides a tremendous amount of fill and backup in the music that is often the only other instrument that I can think of on the top of my head is a piano or an organ that can do that same thing. So what you often find is it adds a great deal of fullness to a band or to the music, as well as some unique kind of sounds. Sometimes I've thought of the instrument as a synthesizer, as the original synthesizer, in that you were able to take any note on the instrument and move it to any other note you want in the scale or in the spectrum. You don't have to pay attention to whole notes or half notes. You can go in between if you want a dissonant sound. But you can move it anywhere you want without interrupting the tone. You never have to change that. You can just move it and then move it back if you want because of the tremendous sustain of the instrument. Or you've all heard Danny Boy. Let's see. So it'll hang those notes forever. And if you want to back somebody up on a song, you can just hit the chord and read a book, do something else, you know. Not necessarily to pay attention to the music. The funny thing about it is you can hit most of the major chords without ever moving the bar. Where did it go? If you're in church on a Sunday, you play that kind of music, and then you can get the minor chord there, or you get the other minor chord. And so what they did was try to figure out all of the movements that you normally had to make with all of those, with that metal bar on the other instruments, and then they designed all of this junk underneath that would do it for you. So it looks a lot more complicated, but musically it's probably more simple. And it simplified everything. All you need to do now is figure out how to make your legs and feet and hands do what your one hand did. Now that's simplification, isn't it? Both feet, both knees, and both hands doing what two hands used to do. That's simple. But it's really not as difficult as it looks. The technique is a lot different. And this will be an example of how the steel guitar is used in backup music, because I don't know this song, so I'm not going to do anything but back him up.
This is an example. What he's doing, what we call a backup, is he's making a lot of nice sounds that fit with what I'm doing, but he doesn't play the melody that I'm singing or playing. He's just making a lot of other noises that fit real well in with what we're doing. So in other words, that allows him, if he doesn't know the song, which he doesn't know this song, to play the song. So once you learn these techniques, you can sit in on something you've never heard or you don't know. So. Today I passed you on the street, and my heart fell at your feet. I can't help it if I'm still in love with you. Somebody else stood by your side, and you look so satisfied. I can't help it if I'm still in love with you. A picture of the past came slowly stealing as I brushed your hand, came so close to you. Suddenly I got that old time feeling. I can't help it if I'm still in love with you.
See what you can do when you don't know this song. You find there's certain patterns in those songs, and once you figure out basically what's going to happen in the song, you don't really need to know it anymore. Just tell them what key it's in, and the same patterns are going to come up, particularly in this kind of music.
When Paul and I put this together, we play in a band, but we don't play all these songs, or any of these songs actually that you've heard today. When musicians get together to jam, we call it, and maybe they know some of the same songs, maybe they don't. I just sang a song Paul didn't know, and he was able, with his knowledge, to play along with it. And now this is a song that he does, and you notice I have to use the words because I don't know the song well enough. I've heard it before, so I have to use the words. So this is a song that he's got down pretty well, so I have to go with his key. So it sounds a little low for me to sing, but he's got his music worked out in the key of C. I would probably sing it in D or E or something like that. So we'll give it a try and see what happens with 6 Days on the Road.
You just start right out.
Well, I pulled out of Pittsburgh, rolled down the eastern seaboard. Got my diesel wound up, engines running like never before. There's a speed zone ahead all right, but I don't see a cop inside. 6 days on the road and I'm gonna make it home tonight. I got the 10-4 gears and the Georgia ride. I take a little white pills and my eyes are open wide. That's Jimmy and the wife. I've been passing everything in sight. 6 days on the road and I'm gonna make it home tonight. Well, it seems like months since I kissed my baby goodbye. I can have a lot of women, but I'm not like some of the guys. I can find one to hold me tight, but I couldn't make believe it's alright. 6 days on the road and I'm gonna make it home tonight. Now the ICC is checking on down the line. I'm a little overweight and my logbook's way behind. But nothing bothers me tonight. I can dodge all the skiers alright. 6 days on the road and I'm gonna make it home tonight. Well, the rick's a little low, but that don't mean she's slow. There's a flame from the stack and the smoke's blowing black as smoke. My hometown's coming inside. If you think I'm happy, you're right. 6 days on the road and I'm gonna make it home tonight. 6 days on the road and I'm gonna make it home tonight. I don't want your lonely mansion without a tear in every room. All I want is love you promised by the ain't no other. But I think I should be happy with your money and your name. Love and sorrow while you play your cheating game. Silver threads and golden needles will not bend this heart of mine.
It's hard for him to sing that one.
Do it again.
No.
Do it till you get it right.
Do it till you get it right. I had one of the titles song.
Do you use the bottom one?
Bottom neck? I don't really now. It's jazz. It's for jazz. I have done a little bit with it, but not too much.
Let's see, we got about 5 minutes. You want to kind of explain how it's used in rock a bit and show a few rock licks?
Yeah.
Yeah, we do well, through the modern miracles, why, there's a lot of things you can do with these now in rock music, and I do a lot of, I guess, Rusty Young of Poco was the one that probably took the pedal steel into another movement in rock, and same with the lap steel. But as a matter of playing tunes, since we don't know of any tunes, what I usually use when playing the rock stuff is the lap steel, because it'll give more of a bluesy kind of sound to it, and I think it has a lot more to offer as far as being a hard sound. Like of course not all rock music do you want to be a hard sound, but if you want to get a gritty kind of sound out of the instrument, or a warm kind of sound out of the instrument, as you might say, it can be gotten, I think, a little better out of this than out of the pedal steel, because this is. Are you familiar with any of Jackson Browne tunes? The Road in the Sky, things like that. Well, we do that in the band, and a lot of the impact of that sound is to sort of make a crashing sound. I mean, the whole effect of that kind of music is the impact of it, and so I wish I had it. I just should have brought a tape, really, because I would have told you a lot more than I could show you. But if you remember that song, the beginning of it, we started that way. It's just sort of. So you can get it's an altogether different effect when you play it that way. And blues is some of the blues songs are the same way. If you want to use that tone, and that incidentally, the grittiness of the sound is not always played in the hard driving rock music. Sometimes it can be used in a really sweet way behind a vocalist in a slow song. And the guy who does that probably the best is David Lindley, who does play with Jackson Browne and Linda Ronstadt and some others, who uses exactly this kind of instrument, this kind of setup, and does those kinds of things, and does probably some of the most tasteful backup licks on violin, and what have you. So the instruments, I guess, are not limited any longer to country. Now, I use the pedal steel in a couple of songs. One, Rodney Crowell's song, Emmylou Harris did, called "Ain't Living Long Like This." And if you're familiar with any of that music and you're familiar with that song, it's a real hard driving rock song, and the pedal steel fits very well into it. And so I'm very interested in seeing instruments go into other types of music as well as country, but that is their origins, and only now are they starting to come out.
Anyway, we're about out of time. We'd like to thank Paul Roberts for coming in today. And,
Thank you.